So this is video 2, and after the fighting got stabilized in the spring of 1951, right around the 30th parallel, MacArthur called for us to expand the war. He wanted us to actually invade and attack China. He wanted us to start bombing China, including what kind of bombs? You guessed it, atomic bombing China. Truman warned him about making these ideas public. The Joint Chiefs and Truman said it was a bad idea. We should not extend the war with China. China is too massive to go to war with, and we might invoke the Soviets as well. And so MacArthur didn't like this idea, so he continued to leak out his dissatisfaction to the press. The press found out that he was upset, and so there's actually an article printed about how MacArthur wants to expand the war with China and wants to nuclear bomb them and so forth, and he doesn't agree with Truman. And so the general, he's being irresponsible. He's disobeying his commander-in-chief, and so Truman is forced to fire him. In April of 1951, Truman has to fire him for being insubordinate because MacArthur felt like he knew what was better to do in this war. So he got fired. He comes back home, gets a hero's welcome. People celebrate his return. People are very upset with Truman and the administration for getting rid of him. He actually goes to Congress, makes this big speech where he says, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Well, over time, after he comes back home and the war keeps going on, people stop supporting him. They don't really support him anymore because he's not in public anymore. So as time goes on, he kind of fades from public viewpoint. And after time passes, Truman kind of comes out after a few months and kind of explains why he did what he did, why it's not good to expand in China, why it's not good to nuclear bomb them. And most people agree, and so MacArthur pretty much fades away. So we don't really hear from MacArthur again after that point, even though MacArthur could himself have been a contender for president in the coming years. He was very well loved, but this Korean conflict did him in, especially when he became insubordinate. So like I said, the war goes on for 2 more years, from the spring of 51 until summer of 53. But it remained a stalemate. Pretty much nothing really happened, kind of like World War I, where the lines pretty much stayed the same for the rest of the war. Peace talks began to happen in July of 51, but the police action dragged on for 2 more years. Finally, with a new president, who's going to be Eisenhower, an armistice is signed. So a ceasefire signed in the summer of 53. So under Eisenhower, in 53, you're going to have an armistice signed or a ceasefire, which is still the case today. North and South Korea established a DMZ, or demilitarized zone, which still exists today as well. And technically both sides are still at war because there's never been a peace treaty signed off between the two sides. But what's crazy about the whole thing is, that the whole thing pretty much finished where it started, because the border, although not exact, pretty much today is still at 30th parallel. So after all that, nothing really changed. 54,000 Americans died in Korea, and of course we had many more injuries in that too. But point being is that the war ended in a ceasefire. It's still in a ceasefire today. No major change really happened there as a result. And you still see, Korea divided today. It's today the world's most heavily guarded border. As far as the consequences go, from the perspective of grand strategy, containment worked. So we did containment. It worked. North stayed communist. South stayed non-communist. Truman used the Korean conflict as justification to dramatically expand the military. So during peacetime in the 50s, Truman used the Korean conflict to justify doing lots of defense spending. And so we started to build up more jet bombers in the 50s, and we started to station more troops overseas. So we'll station more troops in Europe, station more troops in Asia as a result, making sure that we keep a lot of money spent on the military so we're always ready against communist threats. Republicans were very critical and blamed the Democrats at the time for losing China, and they also thought that we could have been a lot harder on attacking Korea. So Republicans weren't as satisfied with the way Truman handled the situation. In hindsight, Truman pretty much did the best he could. Had he attacked China, it would have been a big mistake, and it would have been a terrible decision. So it was the right decision not to go after China as a result. Okay? So that is the containment. We see how it kind of works, kind of doesn't work in Asia. So now we're switching gears, and now looking at the Red Scare at home. If you recall, we had a Red Scare back in 1919, immediately after World War I. Same thing's going to happen here after World War II. We're going to have a second Red Scare after World War II as a result. Truman's administration had a tendency to see a communist conspiracy behind the civil wars in Europe and Asia. So Republicans saw this mostly, but there was a lot of people who were suspicious of communist takeover. You know, that all these countries in Europe go communist, China goes communist, Korea's going communist. So it's just a big fear that it might happen here. And the second Red Scare is much bigger. It lasts for a lot longer. It lasts for nearly 10 years. So it's a lot bigger than the first one. This is the one you're more familiar with, which was McCarthy and McCarthyism and the Crucible, all those different things being made. But there was a tendency to see conspiracies at home in the government, State Department, the military, and so forth. So we're first looking at security and civil rights. First looking at security and civil rights. Let me get a little closer. Let's see that a little better. All right. So in 1947, Truman created what's called a Loyalty Review Board. The very first thing Truman does is create what's called a Loyalty Review Board. Their job was to investigate federal employees. So the Loyalty Review Board's job was to investigate federal employees only. This was pressure put on him by Republicans to make this happen. So in 47, he does this, and their job is to investigate 3 million federal employees to make sure they don't have communist ties. So you have about only 1,000 actually get fired for any suspicious communist connections. It could have been like relatives were in Communist Party, or at one point they were in the Communist Party, but only out of 3 million, only 1,000 get fired. So that's not terrible. But about 3,000 more resign because they felt like this was a violation of their free speech, their civil liberties, and so forth. So about 3,000 resigned as a result of this Loyalty Review Board because they felt like this was unconstitutional. But 3,000 out of 3 million is small potatoes, right? So there's still plenty of people who keep their jobs, but it was a precaution because of what was happening. And I also say this about this era. This era gets a lot of bad rap a lot of time in media and a lot of history books, but what we're finding out in the past 15, 20 years is that there actually was a lot of spying going on. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of records began to emerge from that side of people who were spies on their deathbeds, and people when they get older start to reveal the fact that they were spying back in the day. So at the time, we all thought this was a giant witch hunt. People always thought that all these guys were innocent, that they weren't actually spies, and so forth. And now what we're discovering since the mid '90s and today is that maybe not as much as we made it out to be, but there actually were communist spies at the time. All right, the next is the Smith Act. Not that big of a deal as far as to know, but we'll cover it anyway. In 1940, the Smith Act got passed. It made it illegal to advocate or teach the overthrow of the government by force or to belong to an organization with this objective. So in 1940, the Smith Act got passed. So back before World War II got made, this is in reaction to Nazis and stuff. But it made it illegal to advocate or teach the overthrow of the government by force or to belong to an organization with this objective. This led to communist leaders getting jailed, and the Supreme Court upheld it in 1951. So actually, when the Red Scare happens after World War II ends, the Smith Act gets more enforced because there's this big communist scare about communist takeover, and the Supreme Court actually does uphold it, saying that it's okay to jail people if they're in part of organizations like a communist organization that would advocate a revolution. Because a lot of people back during the Great Depression, the 30s and stuff, joined socialist parties or joined communist parties because people wanted more government action. They wanted more reaction by the federal government. And so now the economy is better, so there's not as many people involved in these communist and socialist organizations. And now it's a bad thing to be. So people try to hide a lot of the fact that they were joining these organizations back in the 30s. And that's becoming more of a taboo situation. The next act is what's called the McCarran Internal Security Act. Again, not a really big act to know, but I'm going to go through it anyway. This comes out in 1950. Over Truman's veto, Congress passed this act that does three things. Number one, made it unlawful to advocate, support the establishment of totalitarian government. So number one is that it made it unlawful to advocate or support the establishment of totalitarian government. Number two, it restricted the employment and travel of those joining communist organizations. So if you had joined a communist organization, your travel might have been restricted. And number 3, it authorized detention camps for people considered subversive. So if you're considered to be subversive, you might be ordered into a detention camp as a result. If they felt like you were a threat and so forth. Okay. So again, that's just kind of you're not gonna have a test question on that, but I just wanted to kind of go through the Smith Act and the McCarran Act because they just kind of show you how things are at that point in the 40s and 50s. Oop. Hang on a second. All right. Now, the next thing you need to be aware of, that you definitely do need to be aware of, is the House of Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, H-U-A-C. So the House of Un-American Activities Committee is actually a committee formed by the House of Representatives. So this is a committee formed in the House, and you do definitely need to be aware of this, of HUAC. HUAC was actually established in 1939 to seek out any Nazi spies, but it gets retooled in the mid-40s to go after communist spies. So they investigated government officials as well as public organizations. So the difference between the Loyalty Review Board, the Loyalty Review Board only investigated federal workers. HUAC can investigate anybody, including federal workers or anybody in the whole country. So they actually go after big organizations they felt like had a lot of influence over society. Two of the biggest organizations that HUAC went after was Hollywood. They went after writers, directors, and actors in Hollywood. They also went after the Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts were also targeted by HUAC to see if the movies or if the Boy Scouts were trying to teach communist propaganda. So actors, directors, and writers were all called to come to the House to testify, to talk about if they knew anybody in the Communist Party and so forth, if they ever worked with anybody who's communist, if they suspected about anybody of communist activity. And they began to rat people out, like the guy from Gone with the Wind. I think it's Cary Grant. Can't think of his name. Anyway, there was suspicion that, or he came and testified and like ratted out a bunch of people. Ronald Reagan was somebody else. Ronald Reagan came out, ratted out a bunch of people whenever he was still an actor and so forth in these hearings. Those who refused were actually held in contempt. There's actually a famous group called the Hollywood 10, who I have it written down right there. The Hollywood 10 is a famous group of 10 actors, writers, and directors who decided not to go and testify, and so as a result, after they were subpoenaed to go to testify, they were held in contempt. So these 10 people were brave and heroic and refused to go testify and rat out people and what they knew was going on in Hollywood and so forth. What the saddest part about this is most of these people were not trying to be subversive and try to promote communist agenda in movies and so forth, but a lot of them lost their jobs and got blacklisted. So over 500 people lost their jobs and were blacklisted, which may not seem like a lot, but some of these, not everybody was a big actor at that time. So some of these people who like that, did these little small bit roles or did this and that, they lost their way of life. Like that was how they made a living. And they weren't the big movie stars, and they lost their way of life. So a lot of these actors and writers and directors got blacklisted and could no longer work in Hollywood because people thought they were attached to communism. This is where a lot of the Red Scare stuff comes in, a lot of the hysteria and witch hunting comes into play, because people who did get accused of all this, mostly in Hollywood, were innocent and weren't really out there trying to promote all this communist hysteria and so forth. The ACLU got involved, the American Civil Liberties Union, argued that the First Amendment was protected their freedom of speech, but that still didn't stop it from happening. So it all still happened as a result anyway. All right, we're going to take a break from our second video right there.